My name is Roberta, and for as long as I can remember, I've been working at my family's tableware shop. We offer everything from fine dinnerware to simple mugs for coffee. It's been a family-run business for generations, a tradition we've always followed. The day everything started to shift was just like any other, until Mrs. Wilson from the bakery next door barged in. She had this knack for drawing attention to herself, almost as if she owned the place. "John," she shouted, striding into the store without hesitation. "We need to talk, right now." Her voice was sharp and demanding, cutting through the air. I stopped for a moment as I adjusted some teapots, but my eyes couldn't help but follow the scene. Dad, wiping his hands on his apron, glanced at me with that look that said, "Here we go again." "Of course, Beverly. What's on your mind?" Dad's voice remained calm, but I could sense he was preparing himself for whatever was coming next. Mrs. Wilson scanned the store before her gaze locked on me. "This is family business, Roberta. Can you give us a minute?" Her tone was pointed, and it didn't sit well with me. But I shrugged it off and moved to the other side of the shop, pretending to rearrange a display of dinner sets. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but their voices carried clearly across the aisles. "I'll get straight to it, John," Mrs. Wilson said, lowering her voice, though it still rang out. "Your store and my bakery have been neighbors for years. It's time to think bigger. How about we combine our businesses?" Her tone was all about business. Dad hesitated, clearly taken aback. "Merging? That's a pretty big step, Beverly. What's brought this on?" "It's not just a merger," she added, lowering her voice even more. "If Roberta and Lucas marry, it will seal the deal." I nearly dropped the teapot in my hand. Lucas, her son, yes, but he was 10 years older than me, and we barely knew each other, despite being neighbors. I peeked around the corner and saw Dad scratching his head, clearly deep in thought. "Lucas is a good guy, and Robert is smart," Dad finally replied. "But marriage? They don't even really know each other, Beverly. Trust me, they'll get along just fine. And think of the business benefits. It's a win-win," she insisted, her voice full of certainty. Dad sighed. "I'll discuss it with your mother and Roberta, of course." After Mrs. Wilson left, Dad called me over. "You heard all that, right?" I nodded, still trying to wrap my head around the idea. "She wants to combine the store with the bakery, and she wants me to marry Lucas." "Yeah," Dad sighed. "What do you think?" I was still reeling. Marrying for business felt more like a script than real life. I don't know, Dad. Lucas seems nice, but getting married just like that? You should meet him properly first and see if you two click. No rush to decide. We'll take it one step at a time." In the following months, Lucas and I spent more time together. To my surprise, he wasn't just polite. He had a sincere side, caring about the business just as much as his mother, but without her overbearing attitude. Our conversations drifted from business topics to personal ones, making it feel less like a business arrangement and more like the beginning of a potential relationship. But the wedding planning? That was a whole different matter. Mrs. Wilson, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, took charge of everything, from the cake at her bakery to the decorations that looked like they came straight out of one of her store displays. One day, while we were discussing the guest list, she marched in with a stack of invitations so thick, it looked like she was planning to invite the entire town. "Roberta dear, I've added a few names to your guest list. People important to our business. They have to be there," she said, dropping the stack with a thud. I bit my tongue, not wanting to argue. Lucas saw my frustration and squeezed my hand under the table. "We'll handle it, Robbie. It's our day, remember." The wedding day felt like a blur. I stood at the back of the hall in my dress, feeling more like a pawn in Mrs. Wilson's grand business scheme than a bride. My dad came up to me with a smile, though it looked strained. "You look beautiful, Roberta. Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." The ceremony flew by, and before I knew it, Lucas and I were officially husband and wife. The reception was noisy, filled with guests who seemed more interested in discussing the future of our joint businesses than celebrating our marriage. The merger went through shortly after the wedding. Our store and the bakery were combined into one large space, each having its own section. On opening day, Mrs. Wilson was everywhere, directing the staff like a military officer. "Roberta dear, make sure those plates are lined up with the pastries. Symmetry sells," she shouted across the store. I did my best to follow her commands. Lucas, on the other hand, was in the bakery section, managing the bakers. Make sure those scones are fresh. How's it going over there, Roberta? He called. Trying to keep up with your mom's obsession with symmetry, I shouted back, frustration creeping into my voice. As weeks turned into months, the workload grew overwhelming. Between managing the storefront, helping out in the bakery, and dealing with all the paperwork, I found myself falling behind in my college courses. Roberta, you're running a business now. You won't need that degree. This is your life, Mrs. Wilson declared one evening, dismissing my education as irrelevant. Her words stung more than I'd expected. Living with them was supposed to save us money and make running the business easier, but it only meant longer hours for me. The house was just a short walk from the store, but the lack of personal space and Mrs. Wilson's constant oversight made me feel suffocated. What started as a partnership was increasingly turning into a complete takeover. I also noticed my dad was around less and less. One busy Tuesday morning, as I opened up the store, I realized his absence. It used to be that he would be there, joking around to start the day. But now it was just me, and the clinking of ceramics filled the silence. That evening, after yet another exhausting day, I visited my parents. The atmosphere in the living room felt unusually heavy, as though unsaid words hung in the air. "Dad, why aren't you at the store much anymore?" I asked, getting straight to the point. My dad looked up, worry etched on his face. "Well, Roberta, it's complicated. Beverly, she's taken over more than we thought." My mom's voice came from across the room, sharp with concern. "She's pushed your father out, Roberta. The contract we signed, it wasn't just a merger. It's like we handed her control of everything." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean, Dad? You've always handled the orders, the suppliers." He sighed deeply, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Not anymore. Beverly rewrote the roles, legally. I'm barely more than a consultant now, with no real say in the business I once helped shape." Anger surged within me, hot and consuming. "Why didn't you tell me?" "We thought we could handle it on our own, without burdening you," my mom admitted, her tone filled with regret. "But it's clear we can't. She's taking everything we've worked for." The following morning, I confronted Mrs. Wilson. The early sunlight filtered through the store as I entered, finding her arranging pastries with her back to me. "We need to talk about my dad," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. She turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, what about him, dear?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You're pushing him out of his own business." "Why?" I demanded. Mrs. Wilson straightened, wiping her hands on her apron as she faced me. "Roberta, your father is getting older. He can't handle the stress of the business. It's for the best. I'm just making things more efficient," she said coldly. "That's not your decision to make," I shot back. "He built this business. You can't just sideline him because you think it's for the best." She scoffed. "Business is tough, Roberta. It's not about emotions. It's about survival. I'm doing what's needed." When the pandemic struck, it felt like the ground was pulled out from under us. Sales plummeted each day, and the emptiness of the store was a painful reflection of the reality we were facing. It was during one of those quiet, stressful moments that I realized we couldn't wait for things to improve. "Lucas, we need to adapt. Take the business online. Offer delivery, start taking orders directly," I proposed, trying to sound more certain than I felt. Lucas frowned but nodded. "It's worth a try. Let's talk to Mom." Convincing Mrs. Wilson would be difficult. She had strong opinions and saw online sales as a gamble. When we raised the idea, she shut it down instantly. "We're not some tech company. We're a traditional business. We'll wait it out," she declared, cutting off any further discussion. But I couldn't just sit by and watch everything fall apart, so I began working in secret. After hours, I used the store's resources to set up an online platform, selling our goods and baking cakes on the side. Slowly, orders started trickling in, then pouring in. It wasn't easy keeping it from Lucas and Mrs. Wilson. I was working late into the night, managing both the store and the online venture. My nights were long, and I found myself sneaking back home well after midnight. One night, as I quietly entered, hoping not to wake anyone, I found Mrs. Wilson waiting in the living room, arms crossed, her expression a mix of anger and disappointment. "Where have you been, Roberta? Look at this mess," she snapped, her voice low but sharp. "I've been working, Mrs. Wilson. We got a surge of online orders tonight," I explained, too exhausted to give a proper response. Online orders? What online orders? She demanded, her voice rising in accusation. Before I could reply, Lucas appeared, drawn by the commotion. Mom, what's going on? Ask your wife. She's running some secret business and neglecting her duties around here. Mrs. Wilson snapped, glaring at me. Lucas turned to me, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. What's going on? Sighing, feeling the weight of exhaustion on me, I said I started an online store. It's been keeping us afloat since the pandemic. I didn't tell you because your mom didn't approve. Lucas rubbed his temples, looking from his mom to me. You should have told me, Roberta. And you, he turned to his mom, should have been more open to her ideas. Mrs. Wilson's face hardened. This is my house, and as long as you're under my roof, you'll follow my rules, both of you. The argument escalated quickly. Lucas, usually my ally, sided with his mom this time. Roberta, you need to manage your time better. Help more around here. Crushed, my heart shattered that Lucas didn't see how hard I was working to save the business, I cut back on the online orders. I began spending my mornings cleaning the house instead of preparing shipments, and my afternoons were spent behind the pastry counter, a reminder of what I had to give up to keep the peace at home. It was a gloomy afternoon when a little girl, around 8, walked into the store, soaked and sobbing, her face streaked with tears. I quickly went over to her, setting aside the plates I was arranging. Hey, are you okay? I asked softly. Before she could respond, Mrs. Wilson spotted us. She marched over, her face tight with irritation. What's this, Roberta? We don't have time for this today. She looks like a beggar. Get her out of here before someone notices, she said coldly. She's just a child, Mrs. Wilson. She's lost and needs help, I protested. Lucas overheard and joined us. His face was unreadable as he glanced at the girl, then at me. Roberta, Mom's right. We can't have kids like her wandering in here. It's bad for business. Just take care of it, he said flatly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Lucas, she's scared and alone. We can't just turn her away. Ignoring them both, I took the girl to a backroom chair, wrapped her in a blanket, and made her a cup of hot chocolate. I wanted to comfort her, make sure she was okay. Mrs. Wilson fumed. This is exactly the kind of distraction we don't need. You'll be responsible if anything goes wrong. The girl, finally calm, told me her name was Sophie. She had wandered away from a nearby park and gotten lost. Just as we were talking, the police arrived, thanked me for helping, and informed me that Sophie's parents had been frantically searching for her. She wasn't far from home. After the police left, Mrs. Wilson pulled me aside, her face hard with fury. Because of your actions, I'm fining you. You took time away from your work. You'll wash dishes for the next 2 days to make up for it. Lucas, standing beside her, nodded in agreement, not offering any support. It stung more than I expected. That night, as I scrubbed dish after dish, I felt more like a servant than a member of the family. Lucas's once comforting support now felt like a weight. Each harsh word from Mrs. Wilson and each silent nod from Lucas reminded me of how trapped I had become. The next day, a well-dressed man walked into the store. He surveyed the place, as if looking for something special. I approached him and asked if I could assist. I'm looking for a premium tea set, he said, his voice calm and collected. I presented him with our finest collection, and he appeared impressed, selecting one of the most expensive sets. As I prepared his purchase, he wandered to the pastry section and picked out an array of treats. Throughout, he remained friendly and curious, asking about the store's history. After completing the transaction, he expressed his gratitude but paused for a moment, his expression becoming more serious. Just so you know, I'm not sure if you recall, but my daughter was the young girl you helped last week, the one who got caught in the storm, he said. I was taken aback, not expecting this revelation. Yes, I remember. She was incredibly brave. I'm just glad I could be of help, I replied. He smiled kindly and handed me his business card. I truly appreciate what you did. If you ever need anything, whether it's advice or assistance, don't hesitate to call, he said. I glanced at the card, Mr. Hayes, a lawyer. That immediately piqued my interest, especially considering the issues I was facing with the store and the merger. Actually, there might be something. Could we discuss a legal matter? It concerns the business my father and my mother-in-law ran together, I asked. Of course, he said with a reassuring nod. Why don't you come by my office next week? We'll go over everything thoroughly. I agreed, a mixture of hope and uncertainty settling in. At his office, I handed him the pile of documents my dad had signed years ago, papers that merged our family store with my mother-in-law's bakery. He scrutinized each page, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. After a long pause, he looked up. There are multiple serious issues here. The contract has several violations. I believe we have a strong case if you're looking to challenge it. He offered to take on the case pro bono to help me fix the situation. Thank you. I'd really appreciate it. But it's complicated. It involves my husband's family too, I said. He nodded, understanding. It's more than business. It's about your life. You deserve to take control. You're not alone in this fight. I left his office feeling a mix of relief and fear. Could I really confront my husband and his mother? But what choice did I have, living under Mrs. Wilson's control and watching them ruin my parents' store? That evening, I returned home to a noisy, crowded house. Laughter echoed through the air as I walked in, and my mother-in-law, slightly tipsy, immediately spotted me. There you are, wandering around when you should be here, hosting your guests. She yelled from across the room. It's your anniversary, Roberta. Don't you have any sense of responsibility? I froze. My anniversary had completely slipped my mind with everything else going on. I'm sorry, I forgot, I stammered, feeling everyone's gaze on me, but my apology did nothing to ease her anger. In a fit of rage, she grabbed a nearby pizza box and threw it at me. It hit my shoulder before falling to the floor. Useless, completely useless, she yelled, her face turning crimson with fury. Before I could respond, Lucas, clearly drunk, stumbled over to me. Look at you, not even ready for dinner. Go clean up, he slurred, spilling wine onto my clothes as if mocking me. The cold wine soaked into my skin and something inside me broke. The humiliation, the disrespect, it all became too much. Wiping my hands on my stained shirt, I faced the room and calmly declared, I've been to a lawyer. I'm getting a divorce. The room fell silent. Lucas and his mother stared at me in disbelief. Who do you think you are? My mother-in-law hissed, stepping toward me. You think you can just... I'm not done. I cut her off, my voice steady. I'm challenging the merger of the store. There's fraud involved, and I've already sent the documents to the authorities and the court. Lucas took a step back, his confidence evaporating. Roberta, you can't be serious. I'm also seeking financial compensation for everything I've gone through, I continued, ignoring his shock. The murmurs in the room grew louder as my words sank in. Without waiting for more reactions, I turned and headed upstairs to pack my things. My mother-in-law followed, her tone now desperate. Roberta, please, let's talk this over. You're overreacting. I stopped, turned, and handed her the lawyer's business card. From now on, all communication goes through my lawyer, I stated firmly. With that, I walked to our room, my hands trembling but my resolve firm. I packed quickly, taking only what was necessary. I moved out of my mother-in-law's house and into a small apartment across town. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom. I wasn't alone. My dad was with me, and together, we would fight for what was rightfully ours. Mr. Hayes worked tirelessly on our case. In the courtroom, he was a bulldog, unyielding in his challenge to the fraudulent merger. Soon, we received the news we'd been hoping for. The court ruled in our favor. Mrs. Wilson was found guilty of fraud, and the merger was reversed. She was also heavily fined, and I was awarded financial compensation. It was enough to buy out our share of the store, a bakery and tableware business that my father and I had once run together. It was surreal to stand in front of the store, now fully ours again, no longer under Mrs. Wilson's shadow. Dad, we did it. It's ours again, I said, handing him the new keys to the store. We spent the following weeks renovating, making the store truly ours once more. Every fresh coat of paint, every rearranged display felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. Mrs. Wilson and Lucas had to find new jobs. The court costs and fines drained their savings. I heard rumors of their struggles, but I kept my distance. Lucas tried reaching out a couple of times, but I ignored him. That chapter of my life was over. I focused on the future. With the store under our control again, I went back to college, enrolling in night classes, determined to finish my degree. Sitting in a classroom again, I felt a sense of hope, a stark contrast to the despair I'd felt under Mrs. Wilson's roof. One evening after closing the shop, my dad and I sat at one of the tables, sharing a pot of coffee. You know, Roberta, starting over like this, it's more than I ever imagined, Dad said, gazing around the shop with fondness. I feel the same, Dad. It's like waking up from a bad dream. We've got a second chance here, and I'm not going to waste it, I replied, feeling a strength I hadn't known I had. We discussed our plans for the future, new products, holiday sales, community events. It was exciting, energizing, and for the first time in a long while, I truly cherished every moment. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Stay amazed.